Hello, I'm Brian Bowen and welcome to Apologetics 101. Today we're doing part 2 of my Bart Ehrman series. Bart Ehrman's probably one of the better known critics of the New Testament that's writing against the New Testament today in North America as far as skeptical scholars go. He's probably most on the popular level, and he's written a number of best-selling books. I decided to do a series specifically on Bart Ehrman. It'll be a while before I do another When Skeptics Respond video. I've done 2 early this week. The last 2 I'll do for a while. Right now I'm focused on the Bart Ehrman series, and also I've got also another series that I'm doing right now on alleged Bible contradictions. I might be getting another part 3 of the Bart Ehrman series probably out before the end of this weekend, because I'm planning on doing one specifically dealing with Bart Ehrman's arguments on textual criticism. And of course, we're going to be dealing with probably Bart Ehrman eventually in other videos and other stuff that I either do, because Bart Ehrman is one of the main skeptics. But today, we're going to specifically focus on the methodology of Bart Ehrman, how he brackets people when he does consensus, how he's inconsistent. He commits a number of logical fallacies in his arguments. I found tons of logical fallacies. He's big on appeals to majority. He's big on appeals to authority. He's big on arguments from silence. These kinds of things are very commonplace. Sweeping generalizations and other types of fallacies are found throughout Bart Ehrman's arguments. He often states things that are factually inaccurate, and he'll mix up factual inaccuracies with some truth. So there will be some facts there and some evidence, but then he'll mix it up with some falsehoods as well, some non-facts and a whole bunch of logical fallacies that he commits, and that sort of thing. And he kind of mixes it all together when he makes his arguments. And his job is simple. He wants to make you as hyper skeptical as he is. And really, Bart is actually not as hyper skeptical as he makes himself out to be to people. But when he gets into debates and when he writes books on a popular level, he tries to make you get. He tries to have this, I guess what Dan Wallace calls a chicken little mentality, where you just kind of, oh no, the sky's falling, going to the extreme and assume the worst. And in reality, it's not as bad as he's making it out to be. And of course, one of the things that I've been dealing with on Bart Ehrman as far as arguments is his arguments on textual criticism. So that's probably going to be my next, where I'm going to be focused on next. But this is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about historical methodology of Bart Ehrman. We're going to talk about his inconsistencies. We're going to talk a little bit about his logical fallacies he commits. I'm not going to get too much into it. I'm not going to show you too much stuff, but I do have some clips. I do want to get into talking about the way he brackets people when he does consensus. I do want to get into a little bit on his inconsistency. That's a big one that he's often been accused of by many, many people. It's not just me that accuses him of being inconsistent. There's a lot of people, a lot of scholars, and a lot of apologists and so forth that accused him of being inconsistent as a scholar. And we'll probably deal a little bit more with the inconsistency thing when we deal with his textual critical arguments. This is going to be big, so as far as that goes, his textual critical arguments, and we'll get to that. I'm hoping to do that by the end of this weekend. I also have a website that I'm making. I'm hoping it's ready by the time around February or March of next year. So probably within the next 7 or 8 months, I'm going to be working on it. I'm hoping it's done by that time. It could be done before that. I don't know. But I'm working on a website now where I'm going to be including things like articles, as well as all my YouTube videos are going to be lined up on there. It's going to be pretty cool. It's going to be another way, another medium in which I'm going to be able to teach apologetics and be able to spread the message of the gospel and respond to attacks against Christianity. With that said, today, like I said, we're going to be mainly focus on the methodology, the flawed methodology of Bart Ehrman. We're going to be dealing with his inconsistencies a little bit. We're going to be dealing with his need to bracket consensus and some other things too as we delve into this. So let's begin. Alright, well, I do have some changes, as you see, to my channel, and there's some changes that I'm making, the way I title it, the way I'm, that's my new theme song that just aired. That's the first public airing of my new theme song. It's one I want to produce right now. I could go back to the old one. I just want to see how this works better, because it's shorter, and I can get better into the content easier. And of course, I've been doing the titles of it like that. So let me know what you think in the comments, if you think I'm doing some nice improvements to my channel. But anyway, let's dive into this. Alright, Bart Ehrman, like I said, we're going to deal with his consensus. First of all, I do want to start out by saying the fact that most scholars agree or disagree with the position has nothing to do with the truthfulness of the position. As far as I know, everyone agrees with that, including Bart, but he will argue that way. It's a logical fallacy is what it is. But it is considered a logical fallacy, a mistaken logic where you assume that just because most scholars say something makes it true, where you argue in a way that seems to imply it, even if you don't actually think that. You're implying it in some way in your argumentation. Hey, believe this is true. All these other scholars think it is. Stuff like that. And the reality is it's not that way, obviously. However, with that said, I don't see a problem with it when it's just simply a matter of you just talking about what where the conversation is among scholars. If you're going to say, hey, look, scholars do dispute this is the reason why they dispute it, but here's where the conversation is. I don't see any problem with that, as long as you're not arguing in a way that makes it look like you're arguing for the truthfulness of the claim in some way, or implying that the truthfulness of the claim in some way is dependent upon how many people just happens to believe it's the case. Like Bart Ehrman uses words like, oh, it's the standard view. Well, that wouldn't, even if it was standard view, what exactly is that, the standard view? I'm assuming he's saying it's mainstream. I'm assuming he's saying that most scholars either almost universally accept it, or they universally accept it, or the majority of scholars accept it, etc. I assume that that's what he means when he says standard view. But it's hard to really tell, but most likely that's probably what he actually means by it. But a lot of times what he thinks is the standard view isn't actually the standard view. As we'll see in a little bit, he brackets scholars. He actually brackets them. And when you bracket somebody, ultimately you're just pretending like they don't exist. And there's some degree of bracketing with scholarship. I mean, for example, if I tell you, we're talking about P52, okay? In the series that launched this channel that I've been doing for almost a year now, was a debate review of a debate that I had with Anand Agrawal from India, a fellow YouTuber, and on the comment section, and I did a series of probably 8 videos of that review, and in that, Anand Agrawal tried to accuse me of doing or appealing to majority when I was talking about P52. So I wasn't appealing to majority because I was telling them what the conversation was, but then I also pointed out evidence. I would point out internal evidence, external evidence in favor of that, I would, and even when I cited Philip Comfort, I would cite the areas where he talks about the evidence as well. So I wasn't appealing to authority, I wasn't appealing to majority, I was just telling where the conversation was among that. Now, in that reference, I would say, well, most scholars do hold to this position, and that would give the evidence and so on. And he said, I say, oh, well, most scholars don't hold it. Here's a guy that does not hold to this position. Now, when I checked out his credentials, he wasn't even engaged in textual criticism. Okay, I think he was had some engagement with paleography or something of that nature. It's a similar field to textual criticism, but as near as I know, he was not engaged in actual textual criticism. He didn't actually look at manuscripts usually and things like that. And so, and I had to basically clarify that obviously the context of it is that I'm talking about scholars relative to the field in which we were talking about. And at that time we were talking about manuscripts, therefore the field is textual criticism. You know, obviously, if I say most scholars think something or hold to this position, if I'm just telling you what the conversation is among scholars, I'm obviously not talking about an English literature scholar or Shakespeare scholar or something like that. I'm not talking about them because they have nothing to do with the New Testament. They have nothing to do with biblical evidence. They have nothing to do with the history of Christianity. They have nothing to do with manuscripts. So, you know, I'm not talking about them. So, to some degree, there is a kind of assuming that there's a kind of a little bit of a bracketing going on. That's reasonable. It's because it's rationally to bracket people that have no relevance in those fields in which you're talking about. Okay, so there should be some bracketing. That's just common sense. It's rational. So it's not a negative kind of bracketing. It's like, hey, how dare you didn't include this person over here, and she's an English literature scholar and she don't agree with you. Well, yeah, but she's also not a textual scholar. So obviously there's going to be some degree of bracketing, which will take a kind of an ounce of common sense. If we're talking about textual criticism, we're talking about manuscripts, which is what I'm probably going to be talking next in the series, a little bit about it at least. Then you know, obviously I'm not including scholars in areas that have nothing to do with textual criticism. But Bart, when he talks about scholarly consensus, assuming he doesn't appeal to the majority, he does appeal to the majority quite often, he does appeal to authority quite often, but assuming he doesn't appeal to the majority, assuming he doesn't appeal to authority, just simply talking about where the conversation is among scholars, he has a tendency to bracket all those who are outside the realm of critical scholarship. And I'm going to explain this to you, what that is. Critical scholarship is basically those people in they're New Testament scholars, but they're not all, another way of putting this, not all New Testament scholars are critical scholars, but all critical scholars are probably likely New Testament scholars, if they're critical scholars of the New Testament. Okay, basically critical scholars are the ones that pick apart the text and try to analyze them. It's basically where you take like a block of text and you take it apart and you isolate it and you examine that and then you know that's how you do it. That's basically, it's basically a way of trying to analyze the Bible in a very non-contextual sort of way. And sometimes people do that with, you know, you got New Testament, you got manuscripts, and they do that kind of stuff. And these are called critical scholars. Most critical scholars are not Christian. Most of them are not. Most of them are not Christian. Not all of them. There's some textual critical scholars which are Christian scholars. Some of them are liberals. A few of them might be conservatives. But most of them are non-Christian. Now, with that said, if you only consider critical scholars and you bracket the wealth of New Testament scholars that are not critical scholars, you know, you're bracketing people like Craig Blomberg, or you're bracketing scholars like Craig Evans, or Craig Keener or Michael Kona, and these guys don't agree with Bart. They have a different kind of position. Some of them are even friends with Bart. I don't know if Craig Keener is friends with Bart or not. I know he knows Bart, but I don't know if he's friends with him or not. I know that both Craig Evans and Michael Kona are friends with Bart, and they don't agree with Bart. But and yet these people aren't being considered when he's bracketing them. And there's a wealth of New Testament scholarship that don't agree with Bart Ehrman. But these guys get bracketed, and it's not just bracketed because they believe in textual criticism, or it's not. They're not just being bracketed because they are critical scholars. They're also being bracketed because of belief in inerrancy, and we'll see that in a minute because Bart has this thing with inerrancy, and we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. But the thing that Bart has is that he thinks that because they believe, if someone believes in the doctrine in inerrancy and inspiration, he thinks that biases their view so much that they can't be trusted objectively. And because of that, he doesn't consider what they have to say when he's doing this analysis. Now, sometimes he tells you he's doing this, and sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes, like I did with Anna Doggerall, I just simply assumed that he would know that I would be bracketing anyone outside this area. Now, in my case, though, it was a reasonable bracketing because this is something you would expect if our conversation was on textual criticism. I'm not going to be talking about English literature scholar. But in Bart's cases, he brackets them unreasonably. If you bracket all the people that disagree with you, all you're going to be left with people is the people that do agree with you. And then he looks and says, well, they all agree with me. Of course, because you just bracket all the ones that don't. That's what happens. Well, the problem is that everybody's biased. We'll talk more about that too because it'll get into that. But it is biased. Most people or everybody is biased. I'm biased. Bart's biased. We're all biased. And because of that, there's going to be people that have biases against the New Testament, against the Bible, against Christianity. You know, they have an anti-theological bias. This has an anti-God bias, has an anti-supernatural bias, anti-Bible bias. You know, they're biased against the Bible. And so that's being overlooked because at least they don't favor inerrancy. And then he stands back while he says, yep, they agree with me. Of course, because you bracket all the ones that don't. That becomes an issue. Alright, so as we get into that, just keep those things in mind. Let's cover a few clips. We're going to talk about Bart Ehrman on his consensus and how he takes consensus. Let's show a clip.
Bart also said that we have no idea who wrote the Gospels and that they were far removed from the eyewitnesses. Well, that's false. The majority of scholars today, critical scholars, have ideas of who wrote them. And we saw that their authors were not at all far removed from the eyewitnesses, and some may even have been eyewitnesses. Bart's view is a position that is held by a minority of scholars if he says we have no idea who knew them, who wrote them, and that they bear no trace of eyewitnesses.
On a couple of points, Mike and I are simply going to disagree. We're going to disagree on what is factual information. I think it is factually wrong to say that most New Testament scholars think that the Gospels are written by people who know who wrote these Gospels. It's factually wrong. Most New Testament scholars say we don't know that they in fact are anonymous writers. They certainly were not the disciples of Jesus. That is by far the widest opinion.
Now that particular debate, I do plan on eventually doing a debate review of that because it's got a lot of materials in it that I do want to respond to a lot of the arguments. And but just to basically narrow it down, they're talking about the authorship of the Gospels there. The debate itself was over the historicity of the Gospels, and Mike mentioned that most scholars held that had some idea of who wrote the Gospels. That's what he argued for. Okay. And then Bart came up and says, nope, that's wrong. It's factually inaccurate. There's no way that most scholars say that we have no idea who wrote them, and that the widest opinion is that it wasn't written by the disciples. In part, he's not completely inaccurate in part. And I'll get into that here in a second. But I'm not going to cover too much about the authorship. I will cover that later on. But in the case of the four Gospels that we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, this is why the information is a little misleading. Everybody agrees that Mark and Luke weren't disciples. Nobody thinks that they were. Nobody argues that they were. Okay, but most scholars think that Mark is getting his information from Peter. The majority of them. It's above 50%. To argue that this is not the case is just completely misleading. And this is one of the things that's kind of misleading in Bart's arguments, because he will sit there and he'll try to argue that that the fact that the disciples or an eyewitness is not writing the text means that information doesn't go back to the eyewitnesses. That's the implication. The reality is actually completely different. The fact that even though we know Mark and Luke are not eyewitnesses themselves, and nobody claims that they are, they're getting their information from eyewitnesses. Luke himself actually says in his preface, Luke 1:1-4, that he's getting his information from eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. And he tells us that in his preface. So they are getting their information from eyewitnesses. Mark is likely getting his information from Peter. We know this from Papias as well as Irenaeus, and Justin Martyr implied that Peter's the source behind Mark's gospel. He doesn't say it explicitly, but he refers to Mark's gospel as the memoirs of Peter in his work Dialogue with Trypho. Now, like I said, and I've actually read that, his work on Dialogue with Trypho. And I read the comments, in Irenaeus is Against Heresies as well. And if I do a video on the authorship of the Gospels, I probably will be citing those sources. But but what Bart likes to do is he likes to cherry pick the data. And he says, well, the Gospel writers don't say, Mark doesn't say he's getting information from Peter. But he doesn't have to say it for us to know it from other evidences. Because there's two different kinds of evidences. There's external evidence, there's internal evidence. Internal evidence isn't circular argument. It's funny how skeptics will cherry pick the data and will look at external evidence when there's no internal evidence, but then look at internal evidence when we have external evidence. And they'll go either way, depending on how they're cherry picking the data. But the reality is that we do know that Mark wrote, or Mark's and Luke are the disciples, or the writers who wrote the Gospels of Mark and Luke, and we, at least with Mark, for sure, that he's getting his information from Peter. Luke tells us he's getting his information from eyewitnesses and ministers of the Lord. Matthew is likely was his own source, but I think he is getting information from Mark as well, because Mark is getting information from Peter. So I think Matthew and Luke are using Mark as a source. This is typically called Markan priority. We're not going to get into that today. So you have that. And of course, John is his own source. He's one of the inner three, and the last of the four Gospels to be written. The Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the only names ever proposed by the church. It's universal. Across the board. All the way across the Roman Empire. We got the quotes scattered. Some are even cited at the same time. And there's just no way that they could do that unless they all went back to a very early tradition, stating that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the writers of those Gospels. And the funny thing is that 2 out of the 4 writers were not even apostles. Or it gets even better, because Mark is always identified as the writer of the Gospel, and Peter is always identified as the source. Mark is the writer, Peter's the source. It must have been overwhelmingly tempting for them to try to make him one and the same. To just make Peter as the writer of the Gospel of Mark instead of. Why would someone make up? Bart has this theory where he thinks Irenaeus made up those names, which they didn't. I mean, two of them are actually earlier than Irenaeus. But he says that Irenaeus made up the name. He has no evidence. It's all speculation. But he thinks that. He says that. And he thinks that they did it for biased reasons, like, wanting to make them apostles. But if you're going to do that, then why would you invent names that weren't popular? If you look at the Gnostic Gospels, 2nd century, they were popular names. Thomas, Mary, Philip, things like that, Peter even. But you don't see that in the 4 Gospels. You see 2 out of the 4 were not apostles. Mark and Luke were not apostles. If you want to establish apostolic authority on the documents, if that's what your goal is, why would you make 2 out of 4 not apostles? One of them, Matthew, is a hated tax collector, and he's writing a gospel to the Jews? He's a hated tax collector. He's considered a traitor by the Jews. John is the last, the one who had the latest of the works in the New Testament. And yet these 4 are unlikely contenders. And yet the church is universally unanimous on these 4 writing these Gospels. I mean, we could point out Papias, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, the Anti-Marcion Prologue, the Maturian Fragment. All of these things point to these 4 writers as the Gospel writers. Papias, and as far as Papias go, it's more Matthew and Mark. Justin Martyr referred to the 4 Gospels as the memoirs of the apostles and cited from them. And in one reference, and this is in Dialogue with Trypho, in one reference he even said, he said that he referred to them as the memoirs of the apostles and those that follow them. And then he cites from the Gospel of Luke, the great drops of blood that Jesus sweat. He cites that from the Gospel of Luke. That's only found in the Gospel of Luke. It's not found in Mark or Matthew. It's only found in the Gospel of Luke. And he cites directly from the Gospel of Luke when he says that that the apostles, or he says that calls them the memoirs of the apostles and those that follow them. And when he refers to the memoirs of Peter, he cites directly from the Gospel of Mark. It's even in the same form. Some of these things are even in the same form as found in the Gospel of Mark. I've had the fragment. It's like it's on that computer over there. But I've had the fragment of what's called Gospel of Peter. That's what Bart Ehrman thinks. Reference Dialogue with Trypho with Justin Martyr is talking about. He thinks he's talking about the Gospel of Peter, which I don't think the Gospel of Peter was even written at the time, because I think it was late 2nd to early 3rd century. I usually lean to early 3rd century. This is actually based on a series of evidence, including the fact, the kinds of legends that are found in the Gospel of Peter are indicative of that. It makes it really, really late. And there are other things too, over dependency of all 4 Gospels and things like that. And we can go into that some other point, but I think it's because Dialogue with Trypho was written AD 140. Everyone agrees this is before AD 150, and the Gospel of Peter has very highly developed Gnosticism in it. And Gnosticism didn't really develop until AD 150. So you're looking at least 10 years or so before Gnosticism was even developed enough. This is AD 140 that we're talking about here in Dialogue with Trypho. So I don't even think Gospel of Peter was even around at the time. But I don't think that Bart's argument really pans out when you actually consider the evidence. But here's the thing. The Gospel of Peter, the fragment that we have that's called the Gospel of Peter, doesn't cite, none of the passages within that cites or alludes to from cite or that the Dialogue with Trypho cited from. When he referenced the memoirs of the apostles, cited from the 4 Gospels. When he says memoirs of Peter, he cited from the Gospel of Mark. It's not found anywhere in this fragment. Now, some people that I discussed with this would try to say, well, maybe, yeah, but it's fragmentary. Maybe it's part of that we don't have. Well, that's convenient. But here's the thing. We work off of evidence that we do have. That's called special pleading. You have to work off the evidence that we have. And the evidence we have does not have that reference in it. I can't judge what we don't have because we don't have it to examine. I can only judge what we do have. And what we do have is that there's no reference at all. The Gospel Mark or the Donald Trump was citing from this fragment that also known as the Arkham fragment. It's also called the Gospel of Peter usually. No one knows if it's really the Gospel of Peter, but that's what people call it, and there's scholars that think it is. But anyway, and so that's, so yeah. So that's evidence, that's external evidence, and this often gets overlooked completely. Now Bart will talk about it if you bring it up. If you don't bring it up, he tries to cherry pick the data and says, where in the Gospels does it say that it's based on eyewitness testimony, or that Mark is getting his information from Peter, or of course Luke actually does say getting his information from eyewitness testimony, or where does it say in the Gospels that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John wrote it? It doesn't have to say in this type of text. In fact, most of the sources that we have from ancient history actually is anonymous, but they are identified. They're not identified. They're anonymous. And the normal historical methodology, the normal historical practice is to look at what other sources attributed authorship to. Like Plutarch's biographies, we have about 50 of them. None of them named Plutarch as the writer. But we have sources that attribute Plutarch as the writer of those biographies. That's why we attribute authorship to him. In the similar manner, we do the same thing with the Gospels. In fact, the Gospels actually has better evidence for its authorship than Plutarch has for his biographies. So that's interesting. But in any given case, Bart has a tendency to bracket these consensus. And so, both Mike Licona and Bart Ehrman are respected scholars and historians, but they differ on what most scholars would actually hold. But if you actually do an actual head count, you actually look at the consensus beyond critical scholars. If you're looking at New Testament scholars, most New Testament scholars, at least above 50% for sure, would grant John Mark as the writer of Mark, and most of them would attribute his information to Peter. And that's the case of the matter. Luke, a bit more disputed, but most scholars would still grant Luke and Acts as being two parts of the same, written by the same writer. Even Bart grants this. Even if they dispute Luke. Matthew's probably the most disputed of the four. Some people argue that John is the most disputed of the four, but I think there's a lot of conservatives that would even reject Matthew. I don't agree with them, but they would reject Matthew's writing it. This doesn't mean that his information doesn't come from eyewitnesses, though. The Gospel of John, most scholars would reject John, son of Zebedee, writing the Gospel of John, but there is a lot of that even a lot of the ones that would reject John writing the Gospel of John would still accept the fact that a disciple of John the Apostle possibly wrote the Gospel of John, or someone closely acquainted to a disciple of John the Apostle. Some people suggested there was another John there. I think that John the Elder and John the Apostle is the same person, but that's a dispute for another day. In any given case, most scholars would say at least large portions of John's Gospel reflects eyewitness testimony, even if they reject John as writing. Now, Bart Ehrman would disagree with this. He will disagree with what I just said there about most scholars think about John and so forth. Because he brackets them, he considers only critical scholars. You don't consider the New Testament scholars that are outside of the area of critical scholarship. You don't consider them. And this affects how he takes consensus as well. Let's move on, because I want to talk about, I'm going to continue consensus, and then we're going to talk about his bias against those who believe in inerrancy, and that it affects how he does bracket these people and takes consensus. So let's listen.
That the only people who really deny that there are any pseudepigraphy in the New Testament are people who have theological reasons for denying it. You won't find anybody, for example, in my country, you won't find anybody teaching at a non-conservative evangelical school that takes that line. It doesn't matter what school you go to. You can go to Ivy League schools, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Brown. You can go to major universities, North Carolina, Florida, Kentucky, Kansas, Texas. And you can go to private schools. You can go anywhere. Anybody teaching anything about the New Testament who is not a conservative evangelical thinks that there's pseudepigraphy in the New Testament. The only people who say that there are not are conservative evangelicals, and that's not an accident. It's because there's a theological reason for saying that there aren't pseudepigraphy. And I understand the theological reason, because these people who wrote pseudepigraphy were lying about their identity and trying to deceive people. And if the Bible is the inerrant, inspired Word of God, you can't have people lying in it.
All right. All right. For start with, that's not the reason, because I mean there are conservative scholars like Craig Evans that rejects John the Apostle writing the Gospel of John, and a conservative scholar Richard Bachman in his debate with Bart Ehrman on Unbelievable actually admit to reject Matthew and authorship of the Gospel of Matthew. So I don't think that necessarily follows that it's just because, you know, that they believe in inerrancy that they would automatically reject that. Because there's some scholars that don't do that. There are scholars that, of course, they could actually have a legitimate evidential reason for accepting traditional authorship. That's where I stand. I have an actual grounds for thinking what I think on that, historical grounds. And I don't find the evidence to the contrary very convincing. And we'll get into that some other time. But right now, I just want you to understand that way he, you notice what he said in that clip, right? He said that if you go to any non-evangelical college or university, that means they don't believe in inerrancy, they don't believe in inspiration, they're not trying to preach the gospel. They basically are against the Bible, in other words. Essentially, they're against Christianity, they're against the Bible, they're against, Christian doctrine. Go to them, and they'll agree with me. It's about like me saying, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. If you don't believe me, go to any church, and they'll tell you the same thing I'm telling you right now. Would that convince anybody? No, it wouldn't. Here's the thing. He don't even seem to hear himself speak in this case, because he doesn't seem to understand that if you're saying, hey, I don't want them to have this particular bias, then what ends up happening is they do have the other bias. They have the opposite bias. The bias that says, nope, I'm against those things. All right? But Bart has a tendency, like I said, to bracket these people because they believe in inerrancy and inspiration. But when you get down to it, what ends up happening is that you're left with your bias. If you bracket the people that disagree with your bias, they're only going to be left with the people that agree with your bias. So of course they're going to agree with it. But they have bias of their own. They're not faultless on that. Alright, let's look at one more clip concerning this need of Bart to bracket those who believe in inerrancy, because we're going to get to the bottom line of what he thinks, because a lot of times in his argumentation, he's attacking inerrancy ultimately. That's what it really comes down to, and he does that a lot. Well, anyway, I'm going to show you one more clip on that, starting now.
So, but my question for you is whether you think there are any errors in the Bible.
I do not have a position on this to tell you. I'm not sure what it is about what I'm saying that isn't coming across clearly.
What's not coming across is
I don't know. I haven't found anything that I am persuaded must be, but I have found things which I do not know how to answer. And from a historical standpoint, I would say, if they're there, then take them as a historian would take them.
I'm having trouble believing you don't have a view about inerrancy.
My view of inerrancy is that I'm weary of it.
I mean, what's the motivation behind this, Bart? Is it that you think that if someone does hold, theologically say, to a view of inerrancy, then that must impact the way they therefore do their historical research?
My view is that a person's assumptions about the Bible are going to affect how they approach the Bible. And so when I approach Josephus, I don't have a theological belief that Josephus is inerrant. And as a result of that, I can look to see whether there are errors or not. If I really, at the end of the day, if because of my religious belief, because of what I do on Sunday morning, or because of what I teach my children, or because of what I really think late at night, if I really thought Josephus was inerrant, no matter how much I wanted to be historical, that would guide my historical research.
All right. So this is basically the core of his problem. He thinks that if you believe in inerrancy, that ultimately that would guide your thinking in terms of that, and you couldn't really be objective historically. Now, of course, no historian is objective completely. Every one of them are biased in one way or another. And there are historians that are biased against God. There's historians that are biased in favor of God. It's just the way it goes. And but if you bracket all the ones that are biased against inerrancy or in favor of inerrancy, you're going to be left with all people that are biased against it. So here's where the problem, I think, really lies, is that when Bart, okay, let's say he used Josephus as an example. All right, Josephus. He gave Josephus as an example. He said, all right, he said that if I thought Josephus was inerrant, that would guide us thinking. Okay, what if you thought Josephus had errors in it? Would that guide your thinking? Yeah. He has said in a debate, I've seen him say this in a debate before, he was trying to force someone one time to admit that there's errors in the Bible. He hasn't demonstrated it yet. He wasn't going to demonstrate it yet, but he thought that the person could not do any kind of historical research. He could not approach this as a historian unless he assumes that there are errors in the Bible even when none has been proven. And I'm sorry, but that's what I call forcing your presuppositions onto somebody else. The reality is that the burden of proof is actually not on us. Okay? If you say there's errors in Josephus, then you have to prove those errors. You can't just assume those errors are there. You might think that there's errors somewhere in Josephus, and that's fine, but you have to be able to demonstrate it. If you point to a particular passage and say, Josephus messed up here, okay, show me the evidence. Show me why you think, give me the reasons why you think that Josephus was in error here, why he made a mistake. The Bible's the same way. It's innocent until proven guilty. If you say it's an error, demonstrate it's an error. You can't just simply presuppose it's an error. You can't just simply assume it's an error. See, the fact is that he thinks that inerrancy guides our thinking, but his belief in lack of inerrancy guides his. Because he assumes that it's an error. Like, for example, when he points to the Bible differences, he assumes it's an error even though he doesn't demonstrate it's an error. He assumes it's an error. He doesn't know that it's an error, I mean, there are other possibilities. He just omits all those possibilities. He jumps straight to the idea that it must be an error because he thinks the Bible has to have errors in it. His bias rules his thinking. Now, of course, our presuppositions always affect and guide our thinking. But the reality is that just because our presuppositions are there does not necessarily mean you can't hold to some sort of objectivity when dealing with these passages and these things and these historical sources. It doesn't mean that you have to be wrong, and you don't mean you don't have good arguments. For example, you can believe in inerrancy and still have good arguments historically why something is true. And if you want to say, no, what you're saying is false, this has errors in it, then it's up to them to demonstrate that it's an error. Not presuppose it's an error, not assume it's an error, not assume that errors are there or present even when none has been proven, but actually prove it. Actually demonstrate that it's an error. Good luck. And so far, they have not done that with the Bible. They've not demonstrated any errors in the Bible. So, yeah. All right. Now, we're going to get on to Bart Ehrman is very, very inconsistent in his argumentation. And this is going to touch a little bit on textual criticism. Okay. Bart Ehrman's Inconsistencies.
On the Unbelievable Radio program in London, you discussed the length of time that exists between the writing of Paul's letter to the Galatians and the first extant copy, that being 150 years. You described this time period as enormous. That's a quote. Could you tell us what term you would use to describe the time period between, say, the original writings of Suetonius or Tacitus or Pliny and their first extant manuscript copies?
Very enormous.
So ginormous would be a good one?
Ginormous.
Ginormous, okay.
Ginormous doesn't cover it. The New Testament, we have much earlier attestation than for any other book from antiquity. What you can't do is then say, well, then you can't trust any book from antiquity. Okay? Yes. Right. That's right.
So it would be correct to write a book called Misquoting Suetonius?
Absolutely. Scholars do this.
And
scholars write books all the time about how you don't know the word, about what Plato actually wrote, or what Homer wrote, or Suetonius, or Tacitus. This is just what scholars do. Of course, there are scads of books on just these topics.
And so when you cite them in your works, you will say according to the best sources, and will question the reliability of Suetonius or Gospel of Thomas.
There's no scholar who's an expert in Suetonius or Cicero or the Gospel of Thomas who would tell you that we absolutely know what these texts originally said.
So when you say know what these texts originally said, but they will believe that we have a sufficiently clear knowledge to quote Suetonius. You quote Suetonius, don't you?
Yes, of course I quote the manuscript tradition of Suetonius. I mean, it's just understood among scholars what you're quoting.
And so you say in your books, I'm not really quoting Suetonius, this isn't really what he said?
I'm saying that we don't have the original text for any writing from the ancient world. The New Testament is no different. Just as you can't establish the original text of the New Testament because you don't have sufficient evidence, you can't establish the original text of Suetonius because you don't have original evidence. For some of these authors, the manuscript tradition is pathetic. I mean, for some very important works from antiquity, we have one manuscript that's a palimpsest. And so, yes, absolutely, we have exactly the same problem. And when you say that nobody goes on about the Gospel of Thomas, absolutely wrong. The scholars of the Gospel of Thomas talk about this all the time, and this is a major issue of scholarship.
Yeah, all right. Bart Ehrman, I've read a number of his books. I got some of his books over there, and even some of his books in there. And Bart Ehrman cites these people all the time without ever saying that we have no idea what they originally wrote. In fact, he says, so-and-so says this. Suetonius says this. Tacitus says this. Plutarch says this. He's very inconsistent. We talked about authorship a little bit earlier. He once told Mike Licona that that his view is that he had no idea who wrote any of these texts. But then he turns around and in his debate with Richard Bachman on Unbelievable, both these debates were on Unbelievable, he sat there and told Richard Bachman they to start on this conversation, this interesting back and forth on Plutarch, and he starts saying Plutarch says this or he does this. Wait a minute, I thought he said on the other program, another debate with Mike Licona, I have no idea who wrote them. Not the case. We have no idea who wrote these texts. We have no idea who wrote all these ancient histories. No idea who wrote, these works attributed to Plutarch. And he says Plutarch says this, Plutarch says that. And he does this all the time in his published works too. Never leaves a footnote. Never puts anything in parentheses, never explains it in the text, never explains it into a footnote or endnote. He's never done any of those things. He cites it uncritically, without question. And he says scholars write about this stuff all the time. Name some books. I'd like to see a book that says misquoting Plato. I would love to see that. There isn't any. So it's weird. They might talk about this in some skeptical stuff on textual criticism or something, but they don't really write books on it. But typically scholars will conjecturalize with things like other classical literature. But what they do is that they do think that the evidence that we have is at least enough to have a basic understanding of what they said. They don't think the copies got so out of hand that we have no idea what they wrote, and therefore any knowledge of history might be lost. It's like Dan Wallace said, this kind of mentality will set us back into the Dark Ages, where we know very little about history, ancient history. Dan Wallace also says that whatever skepticism you want to apply to the New Testament, you better apply to every other work in ancient history 1,000 times over. Because we have better evidence, way better evidence, that even Bart Ehrman admitted to, than we have of any other work in antiquity. Well, that's all I have for that. I just basically wanted to go over it. I knew it was not going to be too long of a video, hopefully. But basically, essentially, I just wanted to cover some of the flawed methodologies of Bart Ehrman, how he brackets consensus, how he's very inconsistent with his own position. He has flawed historical methodology, and we could say more about his historical methodology. I could cover things like his arguments against the resurrection, how he kind of argues his way into a circle and uses kind of a David Hume sort of argument on miracles. And so we can get into that at some other point. Like I said, I am making a website, Apologetics 101 website, and it's going to have articles in it, it's going to have blogs in it, it's going to have my videos in it. Hopefully when it gets done and gets completed, that I'll have it out and I'll be able to link that website in the description box below. So keep watching. I'm thinking about doing a part, I'm going to try to do a part 3 of the Bart Ehrman series, and this one's going to be more specifically focused on textual criticism, and we might be doing kind of I don't know if I want to do a debate review of that debate, or I'm just going to kind of split it up into certain essential clips of that debate that he has with James White. I might do a few clips from Dan Wallace's debate with Bart Ehrman, which was really good. At least one of them was. They debated several times. There was this one debate where they only had 5-minute rebuttals. I think it's the one that Dan Wallace had mentioned, P137. It wasn't P137 at that time. The finding of the fragment of Mark's Gospel, chapter 1, and he mentioned it early before he could verify all the facts, and then you got some misinformation and things like that. and so that there was a whole big hoopla over that eventually later. So that, and of course Dan Wallace apologized to Bart during that. He just had some misinformation and that sort of thing. But in that debate, they only had like 5-minute rebuttals, and so it wasn't the best debate I've seen, period, let alone, on textual criticism. But later they did a better debate where they had longer times to rebuttal, and they could get a little bit deeper into the issues. And I like that one, so if I can find that one, I probably will do clips from that one as well. And probably do some clips from James Watt's debate with Bart Ehrman as well. But I do want to try to cover Bart Ehrman's arguments on textual criticism, since textual criticism is something I've been engaged in, even though I have not specifically done videos yet on the manuscript evidence for the New Testament, which I really want to do, and we'll probably get into that later on down the road. If I can find time, I'll try to cover that in a future video. But in the meantime, tell me what you think in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the video. Like the video helps the YouTube algorithm get this information out there. Also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And I got a lot of stuff in store. Like I said, I'm working on 2 different series right now, the Bart Ehrman series and one on the alleged Bible contradictions. I will probably be doing another alleged Bible contradiction by next Friday, and we'll see how that goes. My website's going to be several months in the making, so but look for it because it will be out eventually. Alright, with that said, just keep in mind, stay in the know and learn the facts the critics don't want you to know, and I'll see you on the next one.